I knew something was wrong the moment she didn't look me in the eye. We were standing in the dealership lot under the hard sun, the key fob still warm in my palm. I had just handed it to her. A brand new silver Honda Civic, clean as a whistle, ribbon and all. She took it like she was picking up a parcel from the post office. No smile, no thank you, not even a raised eyebrow. Just turned toward the driver's side door, adjusted her purse, and said, "Is the registration in the glove box?" 75 years old, and I still hadn't learned. I had wrapped that car in every ounce of hope I had left, the hope that maybe, finally, she'd see me as more than just a safety net with a checkbook. "Yes, it's all there," I said quietly. "Insurance, too, for the first year." She nodded. "I have to go. Ben's waitin'." Ben was her latest, another one who didn't last. I'd stopped trying to remember their names. Always some man, some plan, some crash. Laura was never without drama. But this time, she'd said she was starting over, getting her own place, rebuilding her life. And I believed her. Because I always did. She drove off without a wave. I stood in that lot long after the engine noise disappeared. The salesman came over, asked if I needed help, and I lied. Said I was just taking in the moment. Truth was, the moment was taking me in, pressing on my chest, whispering a truth I didn't want to hear. She didn't want me there. Not for the car, not for the gesture, not for anything beyond what I could give. I drove back home in my own car, 12 years old, squeaky on the left turn, and parked it beside the peonies I'd planted the summer after Henry died. The blooms were opening too early this year, wild with color, careless in their timing. Inside, the house was quiet. Always is. I kicked off my shoes, unwrapped the receipt from my purse, and placed it in the tin where I keep the documents that matter. Title, insurance, transfer form, all in her name. I didn't want her to owe me anything, not legally, not financially. The only thing I wanted, a thank you, never came. For 2 weeks I waited. Not for the car back, no. That was hers, fair and square. But for a text, a call, something. You raise a child, you think there's a base level of decency they won't dip below. But sometimes you find out the hard way. You built a roof where they saw only a floor to walk on. On the 15th day, I went to the bank for something minor, a balance printout, I think. While the clerk tapped at her keyboard, she glanced up and said, "Oh, and just confirming. The transfer for the Honda sale came through last night. Do you want us to move the funds to your savings?" I stared at her. "Excuse me? The vehicle sale? From Ms. Laura Dawson? The proceeds hit your joint account. I assumed it was meant for you." "No," I said. It wasn't. The drive home felt strange, too quiet, like the air had thickened. I didn't cry, not then. I just kept thinking one phrase over and over. She sold the car. No mention, no heads up, no, "Would you mind?" Just gone. I made tea when I got in, but I couldn't drink it. My hands weren't steady enough to hold the cup. She sold the car, and I couldn't decide which part hurt more, that she sold it, or that I wasn't even worth a call to explain why. I didn't call her. I wanted to. Lord knows I stood in the hallway with the phone in my hand more times than I care to admit. But there's a kind of silence that answers more clearly than words ever could. She'd made her choice, and I wasn't going to beg to understand it. Instead, I moved through my days like always. I watered the plants, clipped coupons I didn't really need, read the obituaries even when I didn't recognize the names. That's what people like me do when the phone doesn't ring. We tend to the little things, as if quiet care could somehow fill the hole someone else left behind. But the hole stayed. On the third Monday after the sale, I opened the junk drawer in the kitchen and found the spare key to the car. I'd asked the dealer to include it when we signed the papers. "She'll probably misplace the first one," I'd said, smiling. I held it for a long while. That small piece of metal had meant something once. Possibility. Help. A fresh start. Now it just lay there like a joke I didn't get. Later that night, I sat at the table and wrote her a letter. Not to mail, just to write. Sometimes putting pain down on paper is the only way to keep it from rotting you from the inside. "Dear Laura," I began, "I saw today that you sold the car." And then I stopped. Because anything that followed that line would either sound petty or wounded, and I was too proud for the first and too tired for the second. I started again. "Laura, I'm not angry. I want to say that first. I just want to understand. You said this was going to be the start of something new. A job. A place of your own. I believed you. I wanted to believe you. That's why I bought it. Not because you asked, but because I thought, maybe, just maybe, if I gave you something solid, something real, we might find our way back to each other. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe we've been strangers longer than I wanted to admit." I folded the letter and placed it in my drawer. I didn't need to send it. It wasn't for her. It was for me. Proof that I had tried, that I had still hoped. People think estrangement happens after big fights, loud arguments, slammed doors. Sometimes, though, it's quieter. It happens in the spaces where words should be. In the silence that comes after generosity. In the look that isn't returned. The gesture that isn't acknowledged. The absence that becomes routine. That's how it happened between us. I thought back to the last time she hugged me. Not the ones at Christmas or birthdays, those stiff, side-armed things we both endured. No, a real hug, the kind that lasts just a second longer than necessary. I think it was the day Henry died. She was 23, still living at home, sobbing into my chest like a little girl again. That was the last time I felt like her mother. After that, she pulled away inch by inch. College, friends, independence, distance. It wasn't just physical. It was in how she stopped telling me things, how her voice flattened on the phone, how she started saying thanks instead of thanks, Mom. And now she didn't say anything at all. By the end of the week, I'd made a quiet decision. No announcement, no drama. Just a shift in my own mind. I wasn't going to reach out anymore. I'd done enough of the reaching. If she wanted me in her life, she'd have to reach back. Spoiler, she didn't. The letter stayed in my drawer, untouched. I didn't reread it. I didn't add to it. But I didn't throw it away either. It sat there like a sealed-off wound, not bleeding, but not healed. A week later, I was at the bank for my usual errands. Small withdrawals. Depositing the interest check. Asking the teller if her mother's surgery had gone well. I know how to make a moment feel personal. I've had to. That's what happens when your world gets quiet. You learn to stitch warmth from scraps. As I was leaving, the young man from the desk, Paul, his name tag said, waved me over. "Mrs. Hartley? Quick thing. There was a note on your account. Just wanted to confirm. Are you expecting a wire transfer from a dealership? It came in under your daughter's name, but it was flagged because the account is technically joint." My heart thudded once, like a dropped book. "No," I said slowly. "That must be a mistake. Could you print the details?" He nodded, and turned to his computer. A moment later, he handed me the sheet. It was no mistake. The car had been sold to a private dealership 3 towns over. The payment had cleared into an old joint account I'd opened for Laura years ago, back when she started college and needed help with expenses. I'd forgotten the account even existed. Apparently, she hadn't. I thanked Paul, folded the paper, and walked out into the spring air. The birds were singing too loudly. The wind felt artificial. I drove home in silence, the document on the passenger seat like an accusation. She hadn't just sold the car. She'd used our old account, one that bore both our names, but only one of us even remembered. I hadn't touched it in years, had never withdrawn a cent. I only ever put money in. It struck me then how fitting that detail was. A whole metaphor, printed in ink. She used what I built, took what I gave, and didn't even leave a thank you in its place. Back at home, I made tea and sat with the paper spread out before me. I stared at it until the letters blurred. The sum wasn't enormous, but it wasn't small either. She could do a lot with that money. Start fresh, pay off credit cards, take another trip she'd never mentioned to me. I didn't care about the money. I cared about what it confirmed. She hadn't called because she'd never planned to. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a busy week or a forgotten text. It was a decision, quiet, firm, and complete. She'd closed the door, not slammed, just gently pushed shut. I wanted to tell someone, but who? Most of my friends were either gone or living lives too fragile to carry someone else's sorrow. I thought about my sister, but she hadn't spoken to me since our last Christmas argument years ago. And Henry, well, I told him anyway, out loud, in the empty kitchen. She sold it, Henry, I said softly. And she never even said thank you. The kettle clicked off. The sound felt final. I poured the tea, sat back down, and looked at the paper one last time before folding it and tucking it under the sugar jar. Somewhere she'd never see. Somewhere I'd eventually forget. Or try to. That night, I slept with the windows closed. Not for the cold, for the quiet. I didn't tell anyone about the sale. Not the ladies at church, not the girl at the bakery who always asks how my daughter's doing, not even May, my closest friend from Bridge Club. Some things are too raw to put into words without bleeding all over the room. But I wrote another letter. This time, I didn't even pretend it was for her. I didn't begin with Dear Laura. I didn't imagine she'd ever read it. It started with no name at all, just my hand, a pen, and a clean page. I think I loved you more than you ever knew, I wrote. And maybe that was the problem. I loved you past the line of dignity. I mistook proximity for closeness, sacrifice for connection. The words came faster this time, angrier. I gave you everything. Not just the money, the car, the furniture when you moved out, the checks when you were short. I gave you weekends. I gave you sleep. I gave you the second half of every sandwich when you said you weren't hungry but ate it anyway. And when you stopped coming home for holidays, I still set a place at the table. Not for you, but for the possibility of you. I had to stop and breathe after that one. Sometimes grief doesn't look like tears. Sometimes it's a cold, steady hand putting down a truth you've avoided for years. I kept writing. You were not unkind. That's what makes this harder. You weren't cruel, you were just absent. Gradually. Like turning a radio down, notch by notch, until one day there's only static, and you wonder when the music stopped. I paused again. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the old wall clock. It used to hang in the living room when Henry was alive. He hated it, said it ticked too loudly. Now I barely noticed. I finished the page with a final sentence. You won't read this, but I will." Then I folded it and placed it beside the first letter in the drawer. Two truths stacked like old receipts. That night, I didn't sleep well. My mind kept pulling up memories I hadn't thought about in years. Not big ones, but the small flashes that live in the edges of the heart. Laura, as a toddler in her red boots, chasing the dog across the yard. Laura, at 14, throwing a plate at the wall because I said she couldn't go to that boy's house. Laura, at 21, leaving in a U-Haul, not hugging me goodbye. Always moving away. Always some reason. By morning, I felt hollowed out. Not sad, exactly. Just emptied. As if the realization had carved a new space inside me where something old used to be. So I cleaned. Not out of purpose, but out of muscle memory. I wiped the windows, scrubbed the bathroom grout, rearranged the spices. I even vacuumed the space under the couch where no one ever looks. And in the middle of all that, I found it. The envelope from the dealership. Still sealed. Still thick with the receipt, the purchase papers, and the handwritten note I'd tucked inside, thinking maybe she'd find it one day and smile. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The note read, "This is for the journey ahead. I hope it takes you somewhere beautiful. Love always, Mom." I stared at the word always until it stopped making sense. Then I tore the note in half, slowly, and dropped it into the wastebasket. Not out of hate, out of clarity. Henry would have known what to do. That thought came to me as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the shredded note in the wastebasket. My late husband had a way of cutting through life's noise. He never said much, but when he did, it was steady, unshakable. The kind of truth you couldn't argue with because it wasn't coated in anger or pride, just plain common sense. When he was alive, Laura still called home. She laughed louder, even hugged me sometimes. He had that effect. He was the bridge between us. After he passed, it was like she and I were two islands, drifting farther apart with each tide. I remember the morning of his funeral. The air was too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Laura stood beside me in a black dress that looked borrowed, her hair hastily pulled back. She clung to my arm during the service, her tears wetting my sleeve. For a few hours, I thought maybe grief would knit us together. But grief doesn't knit. It unravels. After the last guest left, she went upstairs, shut her door, and by the next day she was gone to her friend's apartment. We barely spoke except about logistics, bills, boxes, the paperwork I couldn't face alone. It struck me then how much of my marriage had been about balance. Henry softened her sharp edges. I patched the cracks he didn't see. Together, we were enough. Alone, I wasn't. I went to the mantel and lifted his photograph. He was 38 in that picture, holding Laura on his shoulders at the county fair. His smile was the kind you only get once in life. The smile of a man who believes the world is fair, that his family is unbreakable. I touched the glass and whispered, "She sold the car, Henry. The one I thought might bring her back." My voice cracked, though I hadn't meant it to. I set the photo down carefully, as if it might shatter too. Later that afternoon, I pulled out the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were pieces of a life I don't show anyone. Henry's watch, the quilt his mother stitched, baby clothes I'd never managed to part with, and at the very bottom, a shoebox filled with letters. Not my letters. His. Henry used to write to me even when we shared a house, just little notes he'd slip into the sugar canister or under my pillow. "Don't forget the milk. Proud of you. You look beautiful today." Most were ordinary, but they'd kept me tethered in ways I only understood now. I held one with faded ink. Edie, don't let the world eat you alive. You've got too much fire for that. I cried then, but it wasn't the sharp, painful crying of betrayal. It was softer, the kind that comes when you finally hear the words you needed most. Because the truth was, I had let the world eat at me, little by little. With every check I wrote, every favor I extended, every silence I endured from the one person I thought owed me nothing but love. I folded the note carefully and placed it on top of the others. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the light fade, the neighborhood children riding their bikes in the street. Their laughter carried on the breeze. A little girl in pink sneakers fell, scraped her knee, and ran crying to her mother. The woman lifted her gently, kissed her forehead, and carried her inside. I thought of Laura at that age, knees always bruised, hair always tangled, always asking questions I couldn't answer. She had run to me once, too. Once upon a time. I felt the ache of it, yes, but beneath the ache was something else, something almost unfamiliar. Resolve. Henry had been right. I had fire. It had just burned low for too long, and maybe it was time to decide. Not about her, not anymore, but about me. When I think back to the beginning, I wonder if I set the stage for all of this myself. I was 24 when I found out I was pregnant with Laura. We didn't have much then. Henry worked at the mill, and I was sewing part-time for a dress shop downtown. Money was tight, but excitement was thicker than fear. We painted the nursery yellow because we didn't know the gender yet, and Henry joked it was the only cheerful color we could afford. She came in the middle of winter, a squalling, red-faced miracle. I remember how small her fingers were, how they curled around mine with such fierce need. "She'll always be your girl," the nurse whispered, and I believed her. From the start, I gave more than I had. I skipped meals to save money for her formula. I patched Henry's socks instead of buying new ones. When she was old enough for school, I volunteered at bake sales, chaperoned field trips, and stayed up late hemming costumes for the school play. Every time she asked, I said yes, even when yes cost me sleep, money, or pride. Henry worried. "Edie," he'd say, "don't smother her." Kids need to stumble on their own 2 feet. But how could I let her stumble when I knew how hard the ground was? Maybe that was my first mistake. By the time she hit 13, the warmth between us started to cool. She wanted brand-name clothes I couldn't afford, and when I bought the cheaper versions, she wore them with a scowl. Her voice grew sharper, her hugs less frequent. I told myself it was just the teenage years, that everyone goes through them. But even when she left for college, that sharpness stayed. I remember moving her into her dorm. She was impatient, embarrassed by me fussing with her sheets, by the way I labeled her boxes. "Mom, I'm not a kid," she said. I forced a smile, kissed her cheek, and drove home with Henry's hand resting silent on mine the whole way. He didn't say it out loud, but I knew what he was thinking. We'd lost her, or at least the version of her that still needed us. When Henry died years later, I thought grief might soften her. She did cry, yes, but she also moved out 2 days after the funeral. "I can't stay in that house," she said. And maybe she couldn't. But I stayed. Someone had to keep the lights on. Someone had to keep Henry's chair dusted. Someone had to remember. That was when the requests started. Small at first. A little money for a class she wanted to take, help with the rent while she looked for a better job. Then bigger. Credit card bills, a down payment for a condo she never actually bought, bailouts for boyfriends who drained her savings. I said yes every time. Not because I believed the excuses, but because I believed in her. Because I believed one day she would look at me and see all the ways I had stood behind her. But what if she didn't? What if, in giving her everything, I taught her nothing but how to take? These questions circled me that night like restless birds. I sat in my chair with Henry's blanket pulled over my knees, staring at the photos on the wall. In one, Laura was 6, missing her front teeth, grinning up at me with frosting smeared on her cheek. In another, she was 17, arms crossed, rolling her eyes at the camera. In the last, from her college graduation, she stood tall in her cap and gown, smiling for the photographer, but not for me. The pictures didn't lie. The drift had started long ago. The car wasn't the first betrayal, only the loudest. I pressed my hand against the armrest, feeling the grain of the old wood beneath my palm. Henry's words came back like a whisper. Don't let the world eat you alive. Maybe the truth was that I hadn't been eaten. I had fed myself piece by piece to the one person I thought needed me most. And now I was hungry for something I'd forgotten I deserved. Respect. College was the real turning point, though I didn't see it clearly at the time. When Laura got her acceptance letter, I cried tears of pride so hard my blouse was damp. She was the first in our family to go. Henry kissed her forehead and said, "Make us proud, kiddo." She promised she would. I believed her. I always did. The first semester she still called once a week. Short conversations, rushed, but sweet enough to keep my heart warm. "Hi, Mom. Classes are tough." "No, I'm fine. Yes, I'm eating. Gotta go. Love you." Click. I'd sit with the silent phone pressed to my ear, whispering, "Love you too," after the line had already gone dead. By the second semester, the calls came less. Once a month, then once every 2 months. I told myself she was busy, making friends, building a future. That's what college kids do. But the excuses didn't soften the ache. When Henry and I drove up to visit that spring, she looked embarrassed to see us. She walked ahead of us across the campus, waving briefly at friends, but never introducing us. In the dining hall, she picked at her food and kept glancing at the door, like she couldn't wait for us to leave. On the way home, Henry kept his eyes on the road. I could feel the words pressing against his teeth, but he never let them out. Finally, after 2 hours of silence, he said, "She's not our little girl anymore, Edie." I remember staring out at the fields passing by, wanting to argue, but all I could manage was, "She'll come back." Only she never really did. When she graduated, she didn't move home. She took a job in another city, said she needed space. We packed her apartment anyway. Boxes, dishes, lamps. The quiet labor parents do without thanks. And when she waved goodbye from her new doorway, it wasn't with tears or hesitation. It was with relief. After Henry died, the distance grew into a canyon. She called only when she needed something. Rent, tuition for a certification course, money for car repairs, a new laptop. Always practical things, always framed as, "just until I get on my feet." I never asked if she'd gotten there. I just kept saying yes. And each yes was like a stone placed in my own pocket. Heavier and heavier, until I could barely walk under the weight. I didn't mind the giving itself. What I minded was the way the giving erased me. I wasn't a person in her eyes, not a woman, not a mother, not even someone worth a real conversation. I was an account, a resource, a background figure who kept the stage lit so she could perform. That realization came slow, like a bruise spreading. And the car. Well, The car was just the final strike. Proof written in metal and money that what tied us together wasn't love, but utility. One night, unable to sleep, I walked the house barefoot, touching objects as if they could anchor me. The dining table where we'd eaten Sunday dinners. The sofa where she'd once curled up with her books. The narrow hallway she used to race down in socks, laughing, sliding on the linoleum. I tried to recall the sound of that laughter. I couldn't. Not clearly. It was like trying to tune a radio and only catching fragments of a melody. And that, I think, is when it sank in. The girl I raised was gone. The woman left in her place had no room for me. Not really. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with the car. It happened notch by notch, silence by silence, until one day there was nothing left between us but the echo of what used to be. And for the first time, I allowed myself to whisper into the dark. Maybe she doesn't love me. The words landed heavy, but also honest. I sat in Henry's chair until morning light broke through the curtains, letting that truth sit beside me. Not to punish myself, not to punish her, just to finally stop pretending. Money became our language when words failed. It didn't start that way, of course. At first, it was just small things. A 20 slipped into her purse before she went back to campus. A check tucked in her birthday card. I told myself it was love in practical form, a way of saying, I see you, I want you to be safe. And maybe in the beginning, it was. But slowly, quietly, money took the place of everything else. I can trace the milestones by the size of the checks. The rent after college, when her first job didn't cover expenses. The emergency loan when her boyfriend drained her savings. The credit card bills I paid off 3 separate times. The down payment for a condo she never bought because she changed her mind. Every time she promised to pay me back. Every time she didn't. And every time I let it slide. Because what mother hounds her child over money? But here's the thing I didn't admit to myself back then. I wasn't giving just for her sake. I was giving because it was the only way left to stay in her orbit. If I said no, she'd disappear. So I kept saying yes, handing over scraps of myself disguised as dollars, mistaking her brief relief for closeness. There was one day I'll never forget. She called in tears. Real ones this time, choking through the phone, saying she couldn't make rent, that she was going to be evicted. I drove 2 hours in the rain, handed her an envelope with more than half my savings at the time, and held her as she cried. For a moment, it felt like she was my little girl again, leaning on me because she trusted me. 3 months later, I learned she'd gone on vacation with friends. The eviction had been an exaggeration, if not an outright lie. I swallowed it, like I always did. Told myself young people make mistakes, told myself she was just learning. But the truth settled somewhere deep in me, a splinter I refused to pull out. She knew she could twist me any way she wanted, because my love came with no boundaries. And boundaries, I've learned too late, are the backbone of respect. Without them, love sags under its own weight. I think back now to the countless times I reached for my checkbook instead of my voice. When she criticized the way I dressed, I bought her new clothes instead. When she skipped my birthday, I mailed her a gift card anyway. When she didn't come home for Christmas, I sent money for plane tickets she never used. I let money speak because it was easier than hearing her silence. But love dressed as money is a costume that fools only the giver. She didn't see devotion, sacrifice, or care. She saw a resource. Something to tap when the well ran low. The car was simply the final act in a long play where I kept buying tickets for a show that no longer existed. I thought maybe, just maybe, this gift would be different, that it would say, "Look, I still believe in you. Look, I still want to build a bridge." But she sold the car the same way she'd spent every check, quickly, cleanly, without looking back. And maybe that was the moment I finally saw it clearly. Not the betrayal itself, but the pattern. It was never about the car. It was about the truth I had refused to name. For years, I wasn't a mother in her eyes. I was an account. And the worst part wasn't that she took from me. It was that I let her. Because I was afraid that if I ever closed the wallet, I'd lose her completely. And in the end, I lost her anyway. The days after the bank discovery blurred into one another, heavy and quiet. Morning coffee tasted flat. The radio grated on my nerves. Even the birds outside seemed to chirp in mockery. It wasn't grief, not exactly. I'd felt grief before, when Henry died. That was sharp, suffocating, a hollowing pain that made it hard to breathe. This was different. This was emptiness stretched out over everything, like a gray film I couldn't scrub away. I kept to routines because routines don't ask questions. Up at 6, make the bed, feed the cat from next door who sneaks into my yard, sweep the kitchen floor, pay the bills, check the mail. Simple motions, nothing more. But the silence pressed in. There are things people don't tell you about old age. Not just the aches in your joints or the way you forget a name mid-sentence. No, the cruelest thing is the absence of witness. Nobody sees the small battles you fight just to make it through a day. Nobody claps when you get out of bed despite the pain in your knees. Nobody notices when you cry into a dish rag because it's softer than a tissue. Without Henry, without Laura, the house echoed with nothing but my own footsteps. Sometimes I filled it with noise. I'd turn on the television just to hear voices, though I rarely followed the plot. Other times, I sat in the garden and let the hum of the highway remind me that life went on, even if mine had stalled. But there were moments, especially in the evenings, when the silence became unbearable. That was when the old questions returned. Did I do something wrong? Was I too soft? Too strict? Too present? Not present enough? It's a dangerous loop, that self-interrogation, because no matter where you land, the verdict is always guilty. One night, I took a notebook from the drawer and made 2 lists. On the left, I wrote every sacrifice I could remember. Late night sewing, skipped meals, tuition checks, the car. On the right, I tried to list the things she had done for me in return. The left page filled quickly, the right stayed nearly empty. And that's when it hit me. My life had become lopsided, a scale permanently tilted. I had given decades to a balance that never shifted back. I closed the notebook and sat in the stillness. At first it made me ache, but slowly another thought crept in. Something startling, something I hadn't dared admit before. Maybe quiet wasn't only loneliness. Maybe it was also space. Space to remember who I was before I spent myself into dust. Space to sit with my own company without waiting for a phone call that would never come. I brewed tea, set it on the table, and opened one of Henry's old mystery novels. The chair creaked beneath me. The house settled around me, and for a brief moment, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not joy, not yet, but a kind of steadiness. It scared me a little, the thought that maybe I didn't need her after all. But it also lit a small flame inside me, one I thought had long since gone out. It was May who finally broke through the fog. She showed up one Thursday afternoon, unannounced, with a basket of muffins and that sharp way she has of looking at me like I'm a child hiding something behind my back. We've known each other since our girls were in grade school. She's the kind of friend who doesn't waste time on pleasantries when she can smell trouble in the air. "You've been quiet," she said, settling herself at my kitchen table without waiting for an invitation. "Too quiet. What's happened?" I tried to brush it off. "Nothing. Just tired." "Edie," she said firmly, "I know you. Tired looks different. This looks like you've swallowed something sharp." The words hit closer than I wanted them to. For a while, I busied myself with the kettle, watching the steam rise, but eventually it slipped out. "She sold the car." May's eyebrows shot up. "The one you bought her? Already?" "Already," I said. My voice sounded flat, even to me. "No thank you, no explanation. Just gone." May leaned back, crossed her arms, and let out a low whistle. "And I suppose you haven't heard from her since?" I shook my head. "That girl," she muttered, "always was too sharp for her own good. But Edie, you can't keep letting her do this to you. You've been carrying her weight for years." I wanted to argue, to defend my daughter, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself whispering, "She's all I have left." May reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was warm, her grip steady. "No, you're what you have left, and that matters more than you think." The kettle whistled, and I poured the tea. We sat together in silence for a moment, steam curling between us. Then May leaned in. "Listen to me. There comes a point where giving stops being love and starts being self-erasure. You've crossed that point, Edie. Don't look at me like that. You know it's true. You've been pouring yourself into a well that has no bottom." Her bluntness stung, but it also cleared something in me. I'd been dancing around that truth for weeks, maybe years. Hearing it out loud was like finally ripping off a bandage. I nodded slowly. "So what do I do?" May shrugged, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "You stop. You stop giving her money, stop waiting for her calls, stop hoping she'll change. You draw a line. For once in your life, you choose yourself." I laughed, though it came out shaky. 75 years old, and I still don't know how to choose myself. "Well," she said, squeezing my hand, "then it's about damn time you learn." When she left, the house felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but less suffocating, as if she'd opened a window I hadn't realized was nailed shut. That night, I sat down with Henry's old ledger book and began to write. Not letters this time, not lists of sacrifices. Just a plan. Simple steps. Where my money would go, who I wanted to leave things to, how I'd make sure my choices carried weight even when my voice no longer could. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a flicker of control, a spark of dignity. And though the silence of the house still pressed in, it didn't feel quite as lonely. It felt, instead, like room. Room to build something that was finally, at last, mine. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest. Not dread, but certainty. I dressed carefully, not in my usual house clothes, but in the navy skirt and blouse Henry always said made me look like I owned the bank instead of borrowing from it. Then I gathered my folder of documents, the one I kept too neatly organized for someone who supposedly didn't need them anymore, and drove downtown. The bank was quiet at that hour, only a few customers waiting in line. When it was my turn, I asked for the branch manager. They led me to a small office with a glass door and beige walls that smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. "Mrs. Hartley," the manager said warmly, extending a hand. "What can we do for you today?" I set the folder on his desk. "I want to remove my daughter's name from any account where it still appears. And I want to set up a trust. Not for her. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't comment. Instead, he opened the folder and began typing into his computer. We can certainly arrange that. Do you have a beneficiary in mind? I hesitated, then smiled faintly. Yes, the local library. They've been struggling to keep programs running. I want children to have books, not excuses. As he entered the details, a strange calm settled over me. For years, every financial decision I'd made had revolved around Laura. Her needs, her debts, her endless emergencies. Now, with a few signatures, I was reclaiming that part of myself. When the paperwork was done, he slid the pen across the desk. Are you sure? I pressed the pen to the paper. My signature looked steadier than I felt. I'm sure. Walking out of the bank, I half expected lightning to strike, or some inner voice to scream that I was betraying my daughter. Instead, the only sound was the click of my sensible shoes on the tile floor. The world didn't end, nothing cracked open. But something inside me shifted. On the way home, I stopped at the lawyer's office. I hadn't seen Mr. Keating in years. He'd helped Henry and me write our first will back when Laura was still a teenager. He looked older now. Gray hair thinning, glasses perched lower on his nose, but his eyes still had that shrewd kindness. Edith, he said warmly. It's been a long time. Yes, I replied, sitting down across from him. And I think it's time to make some changes. We spent an hour going over everything. My modest savings, the house, Henry's old insurance policy. I told him what I wanted. No more automatic inheritance to Laura. Instead, I wanted clear instructions. The library trust, a donation to the food pantry, and a provision for May, who'd stood by me more than my own flesh and blood. He didn't flinch or judge. He simply took notes, nodding as I spoke. When I faltered, he said gently, "You're not cutting her out of love. You're cutting her out of power. That's different." I left his office lighter than I'd entered. At home, I made myself a sandwich and ate it slowly at the table. For once, it wasn't a meal grabbed between errands for someone else. It was just mine. Bread I liked, cheese I liked, mustard spread exactly the way I liked it. Small, ordinary, but it tasted like freedom. After lunch, I walked to the drawer where I'd kept Laura's letters, bills, old requests. I pulled the whole stack out and set it on the counter. For a moment, I considered burning them, but fire felt too dramatic, too angry. Instead, I tore them one by one, steady and deliberate, until the trash can was full of confetti. When I finished, I sat down in Henry's chair and let the quiet wash over me. I realized something then. I hadn't cut Laura out of my life today. She'd done that long ago. What I had done was cut myself free. That night I didn't cry. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something steadier than sorrow. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was clarity. I sat by the window with the lights off, the street lamps casting their pale glow across the yard. The world outside kept moving. Cars humming by, neighbors taking their dogs out, porch lights blinking on one by one. Life didn't pause for my heartbreak. And maybe that was the lesson. Neither should I. I thought of all the nights I'd sat there waiting for a phone call that never came. Birthdays, holidays, even plain Tuesdays when I just wanted to hear her voice. I remembered the tightness in my chest each time the phone stayed silent, the way I'd invent excuses for her. She's busy. She forgot. She'll call tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. I whispered into the stillness. No more waiting. The words sounded strange in my mouth, like they belonged to someone braver than me. Yet as soon as I said them, I felt a shift deep inside, as if I'd finally given myself permission to stop bleeding for someone who never noticed the wound. I let myself imagine what my life could look like if I stopped orbiting her absence. I could join the book club May keeps inviting me to. I could volunteer at the library, see the very children who'd benefit from the trust I'd just created. I could even travel a little, maybe the coast, maybe the mountains. Nothing grand, but something for me, simply because I wanted it. For decades, my identity had been mother first, woman second. Now, with the role of mother dismissed, perhaps it was time to remember the woman. A swell of anger rose, sharp and hot, not at her, but at myself. All the times I'd bitten my tongue when she dismissed me. All the times I'd handed over money when I couldn't really afford it. All the times I'd accepted crumbs of attention, telling myself it was enough. I pressed my palms flat against the window pane, the cool glass steadying me. "Never again," I whispered. Not another dollar. Not another excuse. Not another inch of my dignity bartered away. The tears came then, not from weakness, but from release. Hot, heavy sobs that racked through me until I could barely breathe. I cried for the little girl in red boots who used to chase the dog through the yard. I cried for the teenager who rolled her eyes at me. I cried for the woman who chose silence over gratitude. But most of all, I cried for myself, for the years I'd lived small, believing love meant giving until nothing was left. When the tears finally stopped, I wiped my face, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down at the kitchen table. My body ached, but my mind felt sharper than it had in years. I picked up my pen and wrote one final line in my notebook beneath all the scattered plans and crossed-out thoughts. I am not just a mother who was left behind. I am a woman who remains. And for the first time, that felt like enough. It happened on a Tuesday, of all days. The kind of gray Tuesday that doesn't promise anything. No holiday, no special meaning, just another square on the calendar. I had gone to the grocery store early, before the aisles filled with chatter and carts clattering against one another. I liked the quiet hours, when I could take my time comparing peaches, or linger in front of the tea selection without someone reaching over me. I was halfway through the produce section when I saw her. Laura. She stood by the apples, phone pressed to her ear, cart already half full. She looked put together, as always. Neat jacket, shiny shoes, hair swept into a style I could never manage. There was a sharpness about her now, a polish that said she belonged to a life I wasn't part of. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. My body froze, one hand still resting on a head of lettuce. The distance between us was no more than 20 feet, but it felt like miles. I told myself she would turn, see me, smile. That's what daughters do, even estranged ones. Some spark of recognition, some flicker of warmth. But when her eyes finally lifted from the apples and drifted across the aisle, they landed on me with a flatness that chilled me. No smile, no wave, not even surprise. Just a blank, polite glance. The kind you'd give a stranger you vaguely thought you recognized but couldn't place. Then she turned back to her phone, laughed at something the person on the line had said, and dropped 2 bags of apples into her cart. My throat tightened. My chest burned. For a split second, I considered walking up to her, forcing her to look at me, to speak, to acknowledge all that still tethered us. but my legs stayed rooted. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. She had decided. I was not part of her world. The realization didn't come like a slap. It came like cold water poured over me, slow and steady. I gripped the cart handle to keep my hands from trembling. When she wheeled past me toward the dairy section, she didn't even glance in my direction. Her perfume lingered a moment in the air, and then she was gone. I left my cart where it was and walked straight out of the store. The cashier called after me, but I couldn't stop. My chest felt hollow, my legs too heavy. By the time I reached the car, my hands shook so hard I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I sat there a long while, staring at the steering wheel, the hum of the parking lot around me. That was it, I thought. Not the car. Not the money. Not even the silence. This casual dismissal, this indifference in the middle of a grocery store aisle, was the last word between us. And it wasn't even spoken. I drove home slowly, careful not to let the tears blur my vision. Once inside, I dropped my purse on the table and sank into Henry's old chair. The quiet of the house wrapped around me, heavier than usual. But after the ache came something else. Something I hadn't expected. Relief. Because there, in that fluorescent-lit produce section, the last fragile thread between us had snapped. There would be no more wondering if she might call. No more waiting for a message that would never come. No more inventing excuses to shield myself from the truth. The truth had stood in front of me, holding a bag of apples, and walked away without a word. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the silence settle. Strange, isn't it? How the very thing you fear most can sometimes be the thing that finally sets you free. From that moment on, I knew. Whatever remained of my life would not be spent reaching for someone who had already turned away. I had mourned her in increments for years. Now the mourning was done. The days after the grocery store encounter felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but clearer, as though someone had finally scrubbed a window I'd been peering through for too long. For years I had lived in a kind of half-expectation, always leaving room for her return. I'd cooked too much at dinner in case she stopped by. I'd kept the guest room tidy, sheets washed, a vase of fresh flowers on the dresser, though no one ever used it. I'd saved stories to tell her, little bits of my day that I thought might make her laugh. All of it waiting for an audience that never came. After that Tuesday, I stopped. I made meals for one, not in sadness, but in acceptance. A piece of fish, a small salad, tea brewed the way I liked it, strong, no sugar. I left the guest room bare, sheets folded and tucked away. I stopped saving stories and started writing them down for myself in a journal, not as bait for a conversation, but as proof that my life had texture even if no one else bore witness to it. The house, once heavy with silence, began to feel like something else. Sanctuary. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, moving Henry's chair to face the garden. I pulled the old quilt from the cedar chest and draped it across the sofa. I opened the windows wide and let the spring air wash through every room, carrying out the stale heaviness I'd lived under for too long. It wasn't grand, what I was building, but it was mine. I also found myself reaching for small joys I had neglected. The stack of novels on the bedside table that I'd been too busy to read. The sketchbook I'd bought years ago, still crisp with untouched pages. The radio station that played old jazz records late at night, reminding me of dances with Henry in the narrow kitchen. One evening, as I stirred sugar into my tea, I realized something that made me pause. I hadn't thought about her all day. Not once. It startled me, the ease of it. How quickly a mind can reorient once you stop feeding it the same desperate hopes. Of course, she still drifted into my thoughts at times. When I passed the high school where she once played clarinet in the marching band, when I saw a mother and daughter shopping together, laughing. But those moments were softer now, more like distant echoes than sharp stabs. And slowly, the echo gave way to something better. Presence. I began noticing the way the light shifted across the kitchen floor at different times of day. The scent of lilacs that crept in through the window near dusk. The sound of children racing past on bicycles, shouting in the kind of joy only childhood knows. Life was still here. It had always been here. I had just been too busy watching the door that never opened to notice it. One Saturday morning, May came by with fresh bread from the bakery. She studied me carefully, as if checking for cracks. "You look different," she said finally. "Do I?" She nodded. "Lighter, like you've put something down." I smiled into my teacup. "Maybe I have." She didn't press me for details. That's the gift of an old friend. They don't need every word to know the story. That night, I sat in the garden under a blanket, the air cool against my skin. The stars blinked faintly above, half hidden by city light. I thought of Henry, of the promises we had made, and the life we had managed to build despite every storm. I thought of Laura too, but without bitterness, more like a chapter closed, a book set back on the shelf. "Thank you for teaching me," I whispered into the night. Not to her, she would never hear it, but to myself, for finally listening. The quiet that followed didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. And in that quiet, I understood something I hadn't before. Sometimes dignity isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply the act of sitting in your own chair, in your own home, with your own peace, and knowing you no longer need to chase what will not come. I sipped my tea, breathed in the cool night air, and felt steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anything. I never heard from her again. Not a call, not a letter, not even a wrong number text that might have been a clumsy excuse to open the door again. The silence stayed complete. And yet, for the first time, it didn't crush me. Life became small but rich in ways I had forgotten it could be. Mornings started with the kettle whistling, steam curling into the cool kitchen air. I'd sit at the table with my tea, looking out at the garden Henry and I once planted. The peonies came in early that year, wild and pink, as if reminding me that beauty doesn't wait for anyone's permission. I filled my days with the things I used to put off. Books stacked on my bedside table, half read for years, finally had their endings revealed. I learned to bake bread that didn't collapse in the middle. I joined May's book club and found myself laughing more than I expected, sometimes so hard my cheeks ached. The house changed, too. It no longer felt like a museum of waiting, every room prepared for someone who would never arrive. It felt like mine, truly mine. The guest rooms stayed bare, not out of sorrow, but out of choice. I moved Henry's photograph to the living room mantel, where the afternoon sun touched it just right. And sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I'd tell him about my day, not with grief, but with a soft smile. I no longer asked what I did wrong. I no longer begged memory for evidence that I had been enough. Because the truth is, sometimes you can give everything: time, money, love, sacrifice, and it still won't be received. Not because it wasn't worthy, but because the other person chose not to receive it. That is not failure. That is simply life. The last letter I ever wrote, I didn't even sign. I slipped it between the pages of my notebook and left it there. You sold the car. But the real loss was never the car, nor the money, nor even the silence. The real loss was you forgetting that love, once given, is not something owed back like a debt. It is something honored, and you forgot to honor it. I didn't write it for her. I wrote it for me, to remind myself that I was not crazy, not bitter, not too demanding. I was simply a woman who deserved more than what she was given. And when I closed the notebook, I felt the kind of peace that doesn't need applause. So here I sit now, in Henry's chair by the window, a blanket across my knees, a book open in my lap. The world outside hums along, children shouting on bicycles, a dog barking 2 houses down, the faint rumble of a lawnmower, ordinary sounds of an ordinary life. But my heart beats steady, not waiting, not aching, just steady. I gifted my daughter a car. She sold it without a thank you. And that was the last word we ever shared. And maybe, just maybe, that silence was the beginning of me finally speaking my own worth. So if you are reading this, sitting alone with your tea, wondering if you should keep giving to someone who only takes, listen to me from one woman to another. Don't. Don't shrink yourself to fit into their silence. Don't pay for love that should be freely given. Don't wait at a door that will never open. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to keep what is yours, your time, your peace, your dignity. And you are allowed, finally, to live.